You don't always notice it right away. It doesn't come with a loud announcement or some dramatic moment that everyone around you can see. It's quieter than that. It shows up in small, ordinary places like a Tuesday afternoon in a grocery store parking lot when you turn off the engine but don't reach for the door handle right away. You just sit there. The world is moving around you, carts, rattling people walking in and out, conversations blending into a kind of background noise, and yet somehow you feel separate from all of it, like you're watching life happen instead of being fully inside it. You've done everything you were supposed to do. You showed up, you worked hard, you kept your word, you played your role. And still, there's been this quiet, persistent feeling that you don't quite belong, not fully, not in the way it seems to come so easily to others. Maybe you felt it at church, standing there during a familiar hymn, everyone singing the same words, and you join in because you know them by heart. But something inside you feels like it's searching for something deeper than what's happening in that moment. You look around and wonder how it seems so simple for everyone else, how they appear so settled, so rooted, while you feel like you're standing on ground that never quite stops shifting. Or maybe it's at work, sitting in a break room where conversations revolve around the same routines, the same complaints, the same surface-level exchanges, and you nod along. You even smile, but inside there's a part of you that feels like you're speaking a different language no one else can hear. You've probably asked yourself questions you don't always say out loud. Why has it always felt this way? Why does it seem like you're always just lightly out of sync with the people around you? Why do you notice things others don't, feel things more deeply, or struggle to settle into places where everyone else seems comfortable? And maybe at some point you even started to wonder if something was wrong with you. Not in a dramatic way, but in that quiet, nagging sense that maybe you missed something everyone else received, some instruction on how to belong that never quite reached you. So you tried. You adjusted yourself in ways that felt small at first. You softened your opinions, held back your thoughts, learned when to stay quiet, even when something inside you wanted to speak. You told yourself that maybe belonging just required a little more effort, a little more patience, a little more willingness to go along with things that didn't fully feel like you. And for a while it worked, at least on the surface. You blended in just enough to avoid standing out, just enough to keep things smooth. But it never lasted. Because no matter how much you adjusted on the outside, there was always something inside you that refused to fully agree. It's a strange kind of tension living that way. From the outside, everything can look normal. You go to work, you show up for your responsibilities, you maintain relationships, you keep moving forward. But internally, it feels like you're carrying a question that never fully leaves you. A sense that there's something more, something different about your path, even if you can't fully define it yet. And that feeling doesn't go away with time. If anything, it becomes clearer, sharper, harder to ignore. There are moments when it becomes especially strong. Late at night, when the house is quiet and there's nothing to distract you. Early in the morning before the day begins and everything is still. In those spaces you can't pretend as easily. You can't distract yourself with routine or conversation. You're just there with your thoughts, with that feeling, with that quiet knowing that your life is meant to move in a direction that doesn't quite match the patterns you've been surrounded by. And maybe that's the part that's been hardest to explain, because it's not just discomfort, it's not just dissatisfaction, it's something deeper than that. It's a sense that you've been positioned differently, even if you didn't choose it, even if you don't fully understand it. It's the reason you've walked away from things that looked fine on the surface, but didn't feel right in your spirit. It's the reason certain conversations leave you feeling drained, while moments of quiet reflection bring you clarity you can't quite put into words. It's the reason you can't fully settle into spaces that require you to ignore what you feel, what you see, what you know deep down. And over time, that difference has likely come with a cost. Relationships that didn't last the way you thought they would. Situations that changed unexpectedly. People who once felt close but now feel distant. Moments where you wondered if you were the problem, if you were too much, too sensitive, too aware, too unwilling to just go along with things. It would have been easier in many ways to just fit in, to quiet that inner voice, to accept things as they are, and move forward without questioning so much. But you couldn't, and that's not because you failed. It's because you were never meant to. There is a difference between not fitting in and not belonging anywhere. And for a long time, those two can feel the same. But they are not the same. Not fitting in doesn't mean you're lost. It doesn't mean you're broken. It doesn't mean you've somehow missed your place in the world. Sometimes it means your place hasn't been revealed yet. Sometimes it means you're being guided away from environments that look normal but don't align with who you're becoming. And that realization doesn't always come all at once. It comes in pieces. In moments where you start to see your life differently, where you begin to recognize patterns that once confused you, where you start to understand that the discomfort you felt wasn't random, wasn't meaningless. It was pointing you somewhere. It was keeping you from settling into spaces that would have limited you, silenced you, or kept you from stepping into something greater. You were never meant to fit in, not because there's something wrong with you, but because there's something specific about your path, something intentional, something that required you to see differently, to feel differently, to move differently. And while that has made parts of your journey more difficult, more lonely, more uncertain, it has also been shaping you in ways you couldn't have understood earlier. So if you've been sitting in that quiet space, whether it's in a parked car, a dimly lit room, or just within your own thoughts, wondering why your life has felt this way, why you've always felt just slightly out of place, why you've struggled to fully connect in environments where others seem comfortable, this is where you begin to see it clearly. Not as a flaw, not as something to fix, but as a sign that your life was never meant to follow the same pattern as everyone else's. And once you start to understand that, everything begins to shift. There was a time when you really did try to be like everyone else. Not halfway, not casually, but fully sincerely, the kind of effort that comes from wanting life to feel easier, smoother, more connected. You paid attention to how people talked, how they reacted, what made them laugh, what made them nod in agreement, and you adjusted yourself just enough to blend into those patterns. You didn't think of it as losing yourself. You thought of it as learning how to belong. It started early in places that were supposed to feel like home. Maybe it was church on a Sunday morning, sitting in a wooden pew that had held generations before you. You knew when to stand, when to sit, when to bow your head. You knew the words to the hymns, even the ones that weren't printed in the bulletin anymore. You said Amen at the right moment, shook hands during the greeting, smiled when people asked how you were doing. On the surface, everything looked exactly the way it should. But inside, there was a quiet distance you couldn't explain. It felt less like you were part of it, and more like you were watching it, participating without ever fully settling into it. You believed you respected it, you wanted it to feel natural, but something in you stayed slightly apart. Like your spirit was listening for something deeper that wasn't being said out loud. That same feeling followed you into adulthood, into the everyday rhythm of work. You showed up on time. You did your job well. You learned the systems, respected the structure, handled your responsibilities without complaint. In meetings, you contributed when necessary, nodded along. When others spoke, understood the unspoken rules of office culture. You knew when to keep things light, when to stay professional, when to avoid certain topics altogether. And again, from the outside, everything looked right. You were dependable, you were consistent, you were the kind of person people could rely on. But no matter how well you performed your role, there was always a part of you that felt like you were playing a part rather than living something that truly fit. It showed up in small moments. Conversations that felt repetitive, like everyone was speaking from a script you never quite memorized. Jokes that you understood but didn't fully connect with. Situations where you could sense something beneath the surface that no one else seemed to acknowledge. You didn't feel above it. You didn't feel better than anyone. If anything, you felt confused, wondering why something that seemed so natural for others required so much quiet effort from you. And then there were family gatherings, the places that are supposed to be the most familiar of all. Holidays, birthdays, Sunday dinners where stories get repeated and laughter fills the room in predictable ways. You were there fully present, sitting at the table, passing dishes, listening to conversations that had been happening for years. You laughed when others laughed. You joined in, added your voice, played your role in the family dynamic that had been shaped long before you even realized it. But even there, even in the place where you share history, blood and memory, there were moments when you felt like an observer in your own life. Not disconnected in a cold way, but aware, deeply aware that something about you didn't fully align with the expectations or patterns that surrounded you. So you did what most people would do. You followed the rules. You did what was expected. You showed up when you were supposed to, stayed committed, stayed loyal, stayed consistent. You learned how to navigate different environments without causing disruption. You avoided making things uncomfortable. You made yourself easy to be around, easy to understand, easy to accept. And for a while, that seemed like the right approach. It kept things stable. It kept relationships intact. It allowed life to move forward without too much friction. But underneath that stability, there was always that subtle tension. Not loud, not overwhelming, but constant. Like wearing something that looks perfectly fine to everyone else. Something that fits the occasion, matches the environment, meets every expectation, but never quite settles on your shoulders the way it should. You could function in it. You could move in it. But you were always aware that it wasn't truly yours. And the more you tried to ignore that feeling, the more noticeable it became. Because no matter how well you adapted on the outside, there was something inside you that refused to fully adjust. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't pride. It wasn't a lack of effort. It was something deeper than that. A quiet resistance, not against people, not against environments, but against the idea of shrinking yourself just to be accepted. You may not have had the words for it at the time. You may have thought it was something you needed to fix, something you needed to work through, something that would eventually go away if you just tried a little harder. But it didn't go away. It stayed with you, growing clearer over time, becoming less of a question and more of a realization. Because the truth is, it was never about your inability to fit in. It was never about you falling short of some standard or missing some social rhythm that everyone else seemed to understand. The reason it never felt right is because your spirit never agreed to it in the first place. There was a part of you that recognized, even before you could explain it, that you weren't designed to mold yourself into spaces that required you to become smaller, quieter, or less aware than you truly are. And once you begin to see that, once you start to understand that the discomfort wasn't failure, but guidance, something shifts inside you. You stop asking, why can't I fit in? And you begin asking a different question entirely. What if I was never meant to? And as time went on, that quiet sense of being different didn't just stay in the background. It began to surface in ways that were harder to ignore, especially in the moments when life slowed down and there was nothing left to distract you. There were seasons when the loneliness didn't just visit. It settled in like an uninvited guest that refused to leave. Not the kind of loneliness that comes from being physically alone, but something deeper. Something that didn't make sense even when your life on paper looked full. There were nights when the house was completely still. The television off, the lights dim, the outside world fading into silence, and yet your mind felt louder than ever. Thoughts moving in circles, questions without clear answers. Memories replaying in ways that made you pause and wonder how you got here. You would sit there sometimes longer than you planned, just thinking, feeling, trying to make sense of something you couldn't quite name. It wasn't fear exactly. It wasn't sadness in the usual sense. It was more like an awareness that something inside you was searching for a kind of connection that your current life wasn't providing. And what made it even harder to understand was that there were also times when you weren't alone at all. You could be in a room full of people surrounded by conversation, laughter, movement, everything that should have made you feel included. And yet there it was again, that same quiet distance. You would listen, respond, participate, but inside it felt like there was a layer between you and everyone else that no one could see. It wasn't that people were unkind. It wasn't that you were being excluded. In many cases, you were welcomed, respected, even appreciated. But somehow you still felt unseen in a way that went deeper than surface interaction. There were moments when you tried to explain it, to put it into words for someone you trusted. Maybe a spouse, a close friend, a family member. You would start to describe what you were feeling, choosing your words carefully, hoping they would understand. But somewhere along the way it would fall short. Either the words didn't capture it, or the response you received didn't quite meet what you were trying to express. Not because they didn't care, but because what you were experiencing wasn't something easily translated into everyday language. So you stopped trying as much. You carried it quietly instead. And in those quiet moments, questions began to form. Not dramatic, not loud, but persistent. Is something wrong with me? Why does this feel so different for me than it does for everyone else? Why can't I connect the way others seem to connect so naturally? These weren't questions of self-pity. They were questions of confusion, of trying to understand why your internal experience didn't match what you saw externally in others. You may have even compared yourself at times, watching how easily others formed friendships, how comfortably they settled into routines, how naturally they engaged in conversations that for you always required a little more effort. You weren't judging them. If anything, you admired that ease. You wondered what it would feel like to move through life without that constant undercurrent of difference, without that sense that something inside you was always reaching for more, even when everything around you suggested you should already feel content. And then there were the moments when the loneliness felt almost physical. Not because you lacked people, but because you lacked resonance. A sense of being truly understood without having to explain every layer of yourself. You could be sitting across from someone who has known you for years, sharing a meal, exchanging stories, and still feel like the deepest parts of you were untouched, like there was a version of you that no one else had fully met. It's in those moments that doubt can begin to grow. Quietly at first, then more steadily. Maybe you started to question your own perception. Maybe you wondered if you were overthinking, if you were expecting too much, if you were somehow creating distance where there didn't need to be any. You might have told yourself to just be grateful, to focus on what you do, have to stop searching for something you couldn't clearly define. But even when you tried to settle into that mindset, the feeling didn't disappear. It would return, sometimes stronger, sometimes softer, but always present in some form. And that's the part that didn't make sense. Because if it were simply dissatisfaction, it could be fixed by changing circumstances. If it were loneliness in the traditional sense, it could be eased by more connection. But this was different. This remained even when your life looked full, even when you were surrounded by people, even when everything seemed to be in place. And this is where something begins to shift, not in your circumstances yet, but in your understanding. Because what you have been calling loneliness may not be what you thought it was. What you have been experiencing as isolation may not be a sign that something is missing, but a sign that something is being shaped. There is a difference between being left out and being set apart. One comes from rejection. The other comes from purpose. And for a long time, it's easy to confuse the two because they can feel the same on the surface. Both involve distance. Both involve change. Both involve moments where you feel like you're standing in a space that others don't fully occupy with you. But when you look deeper, you begin to see that this wasn't random. It wasn't meaningless. It wasn't something that happened because you weren't enough or because you failed to connect. It was something intentional, even if it didn't feel that way at the time, because there are seasons in life when God doesn't bring more people into your world. He pulls you back from the ones you already have, not to hurt you, not to punish you, but to create space. Space for clarity, space for growth, space for you to hear what can't be heard when your life is filled with constant noise and constant interaction. What you thought was isolation was actually separation, and separation has a purpose. It clears out what no longer aligns. It removes distractions that would keep you comfortable but stagnant. It creates an environment where you can begin to see yourself, your path, your calling, without the influence of expectations that were never truly yours to carry. God will often pull someone apart before He sets them apart. And that process doesn't always feel spiritual in the moment. It feels confusing. It feels quiet. It feels like something is missing. But in reality, something is being prepared. So those nights when your thoughts were loud, those moments when you felt unseen in a room full of people, those times when you couldn't fully explain what you were feeling, they were not signs that you were broken. They were signs that you were being led into a deeper understanding of who you are and where your life is meant to go. And once you begin to see it that way, the loneliness starts to change. Not all at once, not completely, but gradually. It begins to feel less like something is wrong and more like something is unfolding. And as that understanding began to unfold, you started to notice something else about yourself that had always been there, something you may have tried to ignore or downplay because it didn't make life easier. You've always seen things, not in some dramatic or mystical way, but in the quiet, everyday moments where most people move along without thinking twice. You would pause, pick up on something subtle, something just beneath the surface that didn't quite match what was being presented. It showed up in conversations first, the kind that seemed polite, normal, even friendly on the outside. You'd be standing there listening, responding, doing everything that a conversation requires. But at the same time, you could feel the tension underneath it. A slight hesitation in someone's voice. A smile that didn't fully reach their eyes. Words that sounded right but didn't feel aligned with what was actually being communicated. You didn't always know exactly what it meant, but you knew something wasn't matching. And while others seemed comfortable taking things at face value, you couldn't unsee what you sensed. That awareness followed you into your work life too. Before anything was said out loud, before a problem was officially acknowledged, you could feel when something was off. Maybe it was a shift in how people interacted, a subtle change in tone during a meeting, or the way decisions were being made without clear explanation. While others continued as usual, you found yourself paying attention, connecting dots, noticing patterns. You could sense tension before it became visible. You could feel when something was being avoided, even if no one addressed it directly. In relationships, this became even more personal. You picked up on things others missed, or maybe chose not to see. The inconsistency in someone's words and actions, the way someone's energy changed when certain topics came up, the moments when something felt distant even if everything looked fine on the surface. You weren't trying to analyze people or search for problems. It just happened. Your awareness moved ahead of explanation, ahead of proof. And while that gave you clarity, it also created a kind of weight you didn't always know how to carry. Because seeing clearly doesn't always make life easier. In many ways, it makes it more complicated. You couldn't just go along with things that didn't feel right. You couldn't ignore what your instincts were picking up. Even when you tried, even when you told yourself to let it go, to not overthink, to just be present and enjoy the moment, there was something inside you that wouldn't fully agree. It was like your spirit had its own quiet voice, one that didn't get louder, but also didn't disappear. And that created tension in places where others seemed comfortable. At work, you might have felt out of place in environments where things were left unsaid, but clearly felt. In relationships, you may have struggled to stay fully present when something beneath the surface felt unsettled. In social settings, you might have found it difficult to engage in conversations that felt disconnected from what you were actually sensing. There were probably times when you wished you could turn it off, just for a while. Just enough to experience what it feels like to move through life without that constant awareness, without that internal check that quietly asks, is this real or is this aligned? You may have wondered if it would be easier to just accept things as they are, to not question, to not feel so deeply, to not notice what others seem to overlook without effort. But every time you tried to push it aside, it came back. Not as something intrusive, but as something steady, something consistent, something that felt like a part of you that wasn't meant to be ignored. And over time, you may have started to see how this awareness affected your choices. You couldn't stay in environments that felt off, even if they looked stable on the outside. You couldn't fully invest in relationships where something didn't align, even if everything appeared fine to others. You couldn't continue conversations that felt empty or disconnected, even if they were socially expected. It wasn't about being difficult. It wasn't about rejecting people or situations for no reason. It was about the fact that something inside you responded to truth in a way that didn't allow you to settle for surface-level comfort. That can be a lonely place to stand because not everyone understands it. Some may see it as overthinking. Others may interpret it as being distant or hard to please. You might have even questioned yourself at times, wondering if you were the one making things harder than they needed to be. But deep down, there was always a sense that what you were feeling wasn't random. It wasn't unnecessary. It was pointing you towards something more aligned, even if that path wasn't immediately clear. And this is where the understanding deepens. Because what you've been experiencing isn't a flaw in your personality. It's not something that needs to be corrected or suppressed. It's discernment. The ability to perceive what isn't being said. The awareness to recognize when something doesn't align even before there's visible evidence. The sensitivity to feel the difference between what appears real and what actually is. Discernment doesn't make life easier in the short term. In fact, it often complicates things. It asks you to step back when others move forward without hesitation. It leads you to question what others accept. It requires you to make decisions that may not make sense to those around you. But over time, it becomes clear that this awareness is not there to burden you. It's there to guide you, because discernment doesn't allow you to settle. It doesn't let you stay in places that drain your spirit or ignore truths that are meant to redirect you. It keeps you aligned with something deeper, something more intentional, even when that alignment requires change, distance, or difficult choices. You weren't difficult. You weren't too much. You weren't imagining things that weren't there. You were seeing clearly in environments that were built on surface-level comfort. And that clarity, as challenging as it has been, is part of what has been shaping your path all along. Because when something deeper is calling you forward, comfort is no longer enough. And somewhere along the way, as that awareness in you grew stronger and your willingness to ignore it grew weaker, something began to shift in your relationships. It didn't happen all at once. There wasn't a single moment where everything changed overnight. It was quieter than that, more gradual, almost easy to miss at first. But if you look back now, you can trace it. You can see the point where things started to feel different. People you once felt close to didn't show up the same way anymore. Calls that used to come regularly became less frequent, then stopped altogether. Conversations that once flowed easily started to feel strained or surface level. You'd reach out and the response would feel delayed, distant, or distracted. And at first, you gave it the benefit of the doubt. Life gets busy. People have their own responsibilities, their own pressures. You told yourself not to read into it too much, but over time the pattern became harder to ignore. It wasn't just one person, it wasn't just one situation, it was happening across different areas of your life. Friends you used to talk to for hours now barely checked in. People who once understood you seemed to look at you differently, like something about you had changed in a way they couldn't quite place or maybe didn't know how to respond to. And in some cases, it wasn't just distance, it was misunderstanding. You began to notice that the more you grew into yourself, the more your choices started to be interpreted in ways that didn't reflect your intentions. Your silence, which came from a place of peace or reflection, was seen as pride or withdrawal. Your boundaries, which you set to protect your energy and clarity, were taken as rejection or distance. Your growth. The quiet internal shifts that were happening within you looked to others like you were pulling away, like you were becoming someone they no longer recognized. That's a difficult place to stand, especially when you've always valued loyalty, connection, and consistency. You weren't trying to push people away. You weren't trying to create distance. In many ways, you were just trying to stay true to what you were feeling, to what you were learning about yourself. But as you changed, the dynamic changed, and not everyone adjusted with you. This is where it hits deeply, especially in the kind of life you've been living. In America, relationships often form around shared routines and environments. Workplaces, churches, neighborhoods, long-standing family traditions. These are the spaces where connection is built, where familiarity creates comfort. So when something shifts in those spaces, it's not just noticeable, it's personal. Friend groups that once felt solid begin to change. People move in different directions. Priorities shift, and suddenly the conversations that once connected you don't carry the same meaning anymore. It's not always dramatic. Sometimes it's just a slow fading, a realization that what once held you together no longer feels aligned. Family can be even more complicated. These are the people who know your history, who've seen you through different stages of your life. So when you begin to change, when you start to see things differently, When you make choices that don't follow the patterns they're used to, it can create tension. Not because there's no love, but because there's a gap in understanding. You may still sit at the same table during holidays, still share the same stories, but there's a sense that you're not fully seen in the way you once were, or maybe in the way you hope to be. And then there are church relationships which can carry their own weight. These are spaces where you expect connection to run deeper, where shared belief is supposed to create unity. But even there, you may have felt a shift. As your understanding deepened, as your awareness sharpened, you might have found yourself questioning things that once felt straightforward, noticing things that didn't fully align. And while you didn't necessarily speak it out loud, that internal shift affected how you showed up. And others noticed, even if they couldn't explain it. Some leaned away, some became distant, some simply didn't know how to engage with the version of you that was emerging. It's in these moments that doubt can return, but in a different form. Not just questioning yourself, but questioning your place in the lives of others. Wondering if you did something wrong, if you could have handled things differently, if there was a way to maintain those connections without compromising what you were becoming. You may have even tried to bridge the gap, to explain, to reconnect, to find common ground. And sometimes it worked, at least for a while. But often the deeper issue remained. Because the truth is, this wasn't just about communication. It wasn't just about timing or circumstances. It was about alignment. And alignment is something that changes as you change. Not everyone is meant to walk with you through every stage of your life. Some people are connected to who you were not, who you are becoming. And when that shift happens, when your values, your awareness, your direction begins to change, it naturally creates distance. Not out of conflict, but out of difference. That doesn't make it easy. It still hurts. It still leaves questions. It still creates moments where you miss what used to be, where you wish things could have stayed the same. But staying the same would have required you to stay the same. And that's something your spirit was no longer willing to do. So the distance you experienced, the relationships that changed, the people who no longer showed up the way they once did, they weren't signs that you weren't enough. They weren't evidence that you failed to maintain connection. They were reflections of a deeper truth. They didn't leave because you lacked something. They left because you were no longer aligned with where they were, and they were no longer aligned with where you were going. And while that realization can feel heavy at first, it also carries a kind of clarity. Because it allows you to stop chasing what no longer fits, to stop trying to hold on to connections that were tied to a version of you that has already begun to change. And in that space, something new begins to take shape, even if you can't fully see it yet. And after all of that quiet tension, the growing distance, the awareness you couldn't turn off, there came a point where everything you had been carrying internally could no longer stay contained. It wasn't just one bad day or a single difficult conversation. It was a build-up, a season, a stretch of time where everything that once felt manageable started to feel heavy all at once, like the weight of trying to hold everything together finally reached its limit. It may have shown up in a relationship first. One that you had invested in, believed in, tried to preserve even when things didn't fully feel right. You gave it time. You gave it patience. You told yourself that every relationship has its ups and downs, that not everything needs to feel perfect to be meaningful. But deep down, you knew something wasn't aligned. You felt it in the conversations that never quite resolved anything, in the emotional distance that couldn't be explained, in the quiet moments where you realized you were giving more than you were receiving, or maybe just giving in ways that weren't being understood. And at some point, you reached a place where you couldn't keep explaining it away. You couldn't keep adjusting yourself to make it work. You couldn't keep pretending that what you felt didn't matter. Or maybe it showed up at work. A job that once felt stable, maybe even rewarding at one point, but over time became something else entirely. The kind of place where you showed up every day, did what was expected, fulfilled your responsibilities, but left feeling drained in a way that didn't go away with rest. It wasn't just about being tired at the end of the day. It was deeper than that. It was the feeling that what you were doing no longer connected with who you were becoming. Conversations felt repetitive, purpose felt unclear, and the environment, even if it looked successful on the outside, felt misaligned on the inside. You may have tried to push through it, telling yourself to be grateful, to stay practical, to not overcomplicate things, but something in you kept resisting, not loudly, but steadily. Or maybe it wasn't one specific area. Maybe it was everything at once. A combination of relationships, responsibilities, expectations, and internal pressure that built up until you found yourself in a moment where you couldn't ignore it anymore. A moment where everything became clear, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, undeniable realization. You may have been sitting alone when it happened, in your living room, in your car, at the edge of your bed late at night. Or maybe it came in the middle of a normal day, when nothing unusual was happening on the outside, but something shifted on the inside. A thought that didn't feel like a passing idea, but like a truth you could no longer avoid. I can't keep living like this. Not said out loud, not announced to anyone else. Just felt deeply, clearly, without hesitation, and in that moment, something changed. Because that kind of realization doesn't come from frustration alone. It doesn't come from impatience or temporary discomfort. It comes from reaching a point where your inner self and your external life are no longer in agreement. Where the gap between who you are and how you're living becomes too wide to ignore. You felt tired, but not just the kind of tired that comes from a long week or a lack of sleep. This was a deeper kind of exhaustion, the kind that comes from constantly adjusting, constantly navigating, constantly trying to make things work that don't feel aligned. The kind of tired that doesn't go away with a weekend or a vacation. It lingers because it's not rooted in your schedule, it's rooted in your direction, and that kind of exhaustion can be confusing, especially when everything on the outside looks stable. You may have asked yourself why you felt this way when you had responsibilities, when you had people who depended on you, when you had built a life that by most standards should have felt enough. You may have questioned whether you were being ungrateful, whether you were overthinking, whether you were expecting something unrealistic. But that moment, that quiet statement inside you didn't come from confusion, it came from clarity. Because there comes a point when your spirit refuses to keep going in a direction that doesn't match what it knows to be true. Not out of rebellion, but out of alignment. Not to disrupt your life, but to redirect it. And that moment, as uncomfortable as it is not a breakdown. It's not failure. It's not you losing control. It's you waking up to something that has been building within you for a long time. It's easy to misinterpret it at first, to think something is wrong because everything suddenly feels harder to tolerate. Things you once overlooked now stand out. Conversations that once felt normal now feel empty. Environments that once felt manageable now feel draining. It's not that those things suddenly changed. It's that your awareness of them became stronger than your ability to ignore them. And that shift can feel unsettling because it often leads to change. Not always immediate, not always visible, but internal change that eventually moves outward. It leads you to start asking different questions, to reconsider decisions you once accepted, to step back from things you once leaned into. It doesn't happen all at once, and it doesn't always feel comfortable, but it begins. That moment where you said, "I can't keep living like this," wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of something. A turning point, even if you didn't fully recognize it at the time. Because that wasn't weakness. It wasn't you giving up. It was you becoming aware of what no longer fits, what no longer aligns, what no longer supports who you are becoming. That was awakening. And once that awareness begins, it doesn't go away. And after that moment of awakening, after that quiet but undeniable realization that you could not keep living the way you had been, something began to change, not all at once, not in a way that others could immediately see, but steadily, intentionally, from the inside out. It wasn't loud. It didn't come with announcements or dramatic decisions that everyone around you noticed. It was quieter than that, more personal. It was the kind of change that starts in how you think, how you respond, how you choose where your energy goes. You didn't wake up one day and decide to disconnect from everything. It happened gradually. You started noticing where your energy was being drained, where conversations left you feeling empty instead of fulfilled, where interactions required you to become someone you no longer felt aligned with. And instead of pushing through it like you used to, instead of telling yourself to just deal with it, you began to step back. You stopped explaining yourself to people who had already decided not to understand you. That was a hard shift because for a long time you believed that if you could just find the right words, if you could just express yourself clearly enough, people would see where you were coming from. But you began to realize that understanding is not something you can force. Some people are not listening to understand, they're listening to respond, or worse, not listening at all. And no matter how carefully you explained your thoughts, your intentions, your growth, it didn't change how they chose to see you. So instead of exhausting yourself trying to be understood, you chose something different. You chose to be at peace with not being understood by everyone. You stopped forcing conversations that felt empty. You could feel the difference now more clearly than ever. The small talk that once filled space but didn't add value, the repeated discussions that circled around the same topics without depth, the interactions that required you to stay on the surface when something deeper was calling you. You didn't become rude. You didn't cut people off harshly. You simply stopped engaging in ways that didn't feel real to you. You let silence exist where it needed to. You allowed conversations to end without trying to extend them just for the sake of keeping things comfortable. And perhaps most importantly, you stopped staying in places that drained your peace. That didn't always mean physically leaving immediately. Sometimes it meant pulling back emotionally, no longer investing yourself in environments that left you feeling unsettled. Other times it did mean stepping away, choosing not to return to situations that required you to ignore what you were feeling. You became more aware of how certain spaces affected you, and instead of overriding that awareness, you started honoring it. This wasn't easy. There were moments when it felt unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. Because for so long, belonging had been tied to participation, to staying connected, to maintaining relationships even when they didn't fully align. So stepping back felt like you were breaking a pattern, like you were doing something that others might not understand. But at the same time, there was a quiet sense of relief that came with it, a lightness that you hadn't felt before. And as you stopped doing certain things, you also started choosing differently. Not in a dramatic way, but in small, consistent ways that began to reshape your life. You started choosing quiet over noise. Not because you didn't enjoy being around people, but because you began to value the clarity that comes in stillness. The constant noise, the endless conversations, the distractions that once filled your time no longer felt necessary. You found something in quiet moments that you couldn't find anywhere else. A sense of grounding, a space where your thoughts could settle, where your awareness could deepen, where you could hear yourself without interference. You started choosing peace over approval. This may have been one of the most significant shifts. For a long time, a part of belonging involved being accepted, being liked, being understood. But you began to see that chasing approval often required you to compromise your peace. To say things you didn't fully mean, to stay in situations that didn't feel right, to adjust yourself in ways that left you unsettled. And at some point, you made a decision, not out loud, but internally. Peace mattered more. Even if it meant not everyone agreed with you. Even if it meant some people didn't understand your choices. You started choosing truth over comfort. This didn't mean you went around confronting people or creating conflict. It meant you stopped pretending. You stopped agreeing with things that didn't feel true to you. You stopped ignoring what you sensed, what you knew, what you felt deep down. You allowed yourself to stand in that truth, even when it made things quieter, even when it created distance. And these choices began to show up in your everyday life in ways that were simple but meaningful. Sitting alone with your coffee in the morning became something you looked forward to, not as a sign of isolation, but as a moment of clarity, a time where you didn't have to perform, didn't have to respond, didn't have to adjust, just a quiet space to be present. Driving in silence started to feel better than filling the space with noise or forced conversations. You no longer felt the need to distract yourself constantly. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It felt full in a different way. Reflective, grounding, even comforting. And as your choices shifted, your circle began to change as well. It became smaller. Not necessarily because you pushed people away, but because you stopped holding on to connections that no longer aligned. Fewer people, fewer interactions, but more clarity, more understanding of who you are, what you value, what you need. That can feel unfamiliar at first, because society often equates more with better, more friends, more activity, more engagement. But what you began to experience was different. Less noise, but more meaning. Fewer connections, but more alignment. And in that space, something important started to take shape. You were no longer trying to belong everywhere. You were beginning to understand where you actually belong. And that changes everything. And as those changes settled into your life, as the noise quieted and your world became more intentional, a deeper understanding began to rise, one that reframed everything you had been through. Because when you look back now, when you trace the path from where you started to where you are, you begin to see that what once felt like rejection was never truly rejection at all. It was redirection. At the time, it didn't feel that way. When people pulled away, when relationships shifted, when doors closed, or environments became uncomfortable, it felt personal. It felt like loss. It felt like something was being taken from you, something you had invested in, something you believed would remain. You questioned it. You wrestled with it. You tried to understand why things that once felt stable suddenly no longer held the same place in your life. But now, with a clearer perspective, you can see that those changes didn't happen randomly. They weren't accidents. They weren't punishments. They were movements. Quiet, intentional adjustments that were guiding you away from spaces that could no longer support who you were becoming. Because the truth is, God doesn't remove things from your life without purpose. And He certainly doesn't remove people or environments just to leave you empty. What He does often in ways that don't make sense at the time is reposition you. Not just physically, but spiritually, mentally, emotionally. He shifts your environment so that it aligns with the direction your life is meant to go. And that process doesn't always feel like progress. It can feel like loss. It can feel like confusion. It can feel like you're being pulled away from everything familiar without a clear understanding of what's ahead. But repositioning rarely feels comfortable in the moment. It requires movement. It requires letting go. It requires stepping into spaces that aren't fully defined yet. What you thought was rejection was actually protection. Protection from staying in places that would have limited your growth. Protection from relationships that, while meaningful at one time, were not meant to carry you into your next season. Protection from environments that required you to shrink to adjust to silence parts of yourself that were meant to develop. God wasn't removing you from people to hurt you. He was removing you from environments that couldn't carry where you're going next. And when you begin to see it through that lens, the pain of those transitions starts to take on a different meaning. It doesn't erase the difficulty. It doesn't make the process easy, but it gives it purpose. It allows you to understand that what felt like something being taken away was actually something being cleared out. If you look at the patterns in your life, you may start to notice that the times when things shifted the most were also the times when you were on the edge of growth, when your awareness was increasing, when your perspective was changing, when you were beginning to see things differently than you had before. And in those moments, the environments and relationships that once felt aligned no longer fit the same way. This is not new. It's a pattern that has existed long before your story began. When you look at the lives of those who were chosen in the Bible, you see this same pattern repeated over and over again. They were rarely understood in their familiar environments. They were often separated, moved, repositioned in ways that didn't make sense at the time. Joseph was misunderstood and distanced from his own family before he stepped into his purpose. Moses was pulled away from the life he knew before he was called to lead. David spent time isolated, overlooked, even pursued before he stepped into his role. These were not random hardships. They were part of a process that required them to be removed from what was familiar so they could be prepared for what was ahead. And while your life may not look the same as theirs, the pattern is similar. Being chosen doesn't mean being comfortable. It doesn't mean being widely understood. It often means being repositioned in ways that others around you don't fully grasp. You are being moved away from noise. The constant conversations, the expectations, the influences that once filled your space. Not because those things were inherently wrong, but because they were no longer necessary for where you're going. Noise can be comforting because it keeps you occupied, but it can also keep you distracted. And in order for you to hear clearly, to understand your direction, that noise had to be reduced. You are being moved away from distraction. The routines, the environments, the patterns that once shaped your days, but no longer aligned with your purpose. Distraction doesn't always look negative. Sometimes it looks like stability, like normalcy, like things that seem fine on the surface. But if those things keep you from seeing what you're meant to see, from stepping into what you're meant to step into, they become obstacles rather than support. And most importantly, you are being moved toward purpose. Not in a way that is immediately obvious or clearly defined, but in a way that prepares you, that aligns your thinking, your awareness, your choices with something greater than what you've experienced before. Purpose is not something that is simply handed to you fully formed. It's something you grow into, and in order to grow into it, certain things have to be removed, certain spaces have to be cleared, certain patterns have to be broken. Not because they were bad, but because they were not meant to be permanent. So when you look back at the distance, the changes, the moments that felt like rejection, you begin to see them differently. Not as something that happened to you, but as something that was happening for you. A repositioning, a realignment, a preparation. And even if you don't fully see where it's leading yet, you can begin to trust that the movement itself has meaning. And when you step back far enough to see the pattern, when you allow everything you've experienced to line up in a way that finally makes sense. This is where the truth becomes clear, not as a theory, not as something comforting to believe, but as something real that has been shaping your life from the very beginning. You were never meant to fit in. Not because you were lacking something, not because you missed something others received, but because the path you were placed on was never designed to be shaped by the systems around you. You were never meant to fully blend into environments that required you to ignore what you feel, to silence what you see, or to shrink what makes you different. Think about it. Every time you tried to fully fit in, something inside you resisted. Not loudly, not in a way that disrupted everything, but consistently. You could follow the routine, you could say the right things, you could meet expectations, but there was always that quiet awareness that something wasn't aligned, and no matter how much you adjusted, that awareness never went away. Because fitting in would have required you to disconnect from what makes you who you are. If you had fit in, you would have stayed where you were. You would have accepted environments that felt comfortable but weren't meant to be permanent. You would have continued in patterns that looked stable on the outside, but didn't lead you where you were meant to go. And in that stability, you would have missed the movement that was necessary for your growth. If you had fit in, you would have settled. Not in a way that looked like failure, but in a way that looked like normalcy. A life that checked all the boxes, met all the expectations, stayed within the boundaries that others understood. But deep down, you would have known there was more. And that quiet knowing would have remained unfulfilled because fitting in would have required you to ignore it. If you had fit in, you would have silenced what makes you different. The awareness you carry, the discernment that guides you, the sensitivity to truth that doesn't allow you to stay where things don't align. You would have learned to overlook it, to push it aside, to treat it as something unnecessary instead of something essential. And in doing that, you would have disconnected from the very thing that has been leading you all along. So the discomfort you felt, the tension, the moments where you couldn't fully settle, they were not problems to be solved. They were signals, indicators that you were not meant to conform to what was around you, but to move according to something deeper within you. Your difference is not the problem, it's the assignment. It's the reason you see what others overlook. It's the reason you feel what others dismiss. It's the reason you can't stay where things don't align, even when it would be easier to do so. That difference has been guiding your decisions, shaping your path, leading you away from what is familiar and toward what is meant for you. And while that has made your journey more complex, more challenging at times, it has also kept you from becoming something you were never meant to be. Because fitting in would have been easier, but it would have cost you your direction. And now, standing where you are with everything you've experienced, everything you've learned, everything you've had to walk away from, and everything you've begun to understand, you can finally see that the very thing you once questioned is the very thing that has been guiding you all along. You were never meant to fit in. You were meant to follow something higher. And when you finally stop resisting that truth, when you stop trying to force yourself into places that were never designed to hold you, something begins to shift in a way that feels both subtle and life-changing at the same time. Not everything around you suddenly becomes perfect. Your circumstances may not immediately transform, but something inside you settles, and that internal shift begins to change how you experience everything else. You become more at peace even if life isn't perfect. That's one of the first things you notice. The constant tension that used to follow you, the quiet pressure to adjust, to explain, to fit into expectations that never quite felt right. It begins to loosen its grip. You're not as restless as you used to be. You're not second-guessing yourself in every interaction. You're not replaying conversations wondering if you said the right thing or if you should have handled something differently. There's a steadiness that begins to take root, not because everything around you has changed, but because you're no longer trying to be someone you're not. And with that peace comes a different kind of clarity. You start to see situations for what they are not, what you hoped they would be. You recognize what aligns with you and what doesn't, without needing to overanalyze it. Decisions that once felt complicated become simpler, not because the choices are easy, but because you're no longer trying to make everything fit. You're allowing things to either align or fall away. And something else begins to happen, something you may not have expected. You start to attract people who understand you without requiring a full explanation. Not a large crowd, not a wide circle, but the right kind of connections. The kind where you don't have to explain every layer of yourself just to be accepted. Conversations feel different. They have depth. They have meaning. There's a sense of recognition, not because you've known each other for years, but because there's alignment in how you see things, how you think, how you move through life. These connections don't require you to perform. You don't feel the need to adjust yourself to keep them. They don't drain you in the way that past interactions sometimes did. Instead, they feel natural, even if they're fewer. And that's when you begin to understand that it was never about having more people in your life. It was about having the right ones. At the same time, you stop chasing validation in the way you once did. You no longer feel the need for everyone to agree with you, to understand your decisions, to approve of the direction you're taking. That doesn't mean you become disconnected or indifferent. It means your sense of direction is no longer dependent on external confirmation. You begin to trust what you feel, what you see, what you know internally, without needing it to be echoed back to you by everyone around you. And that shift shows up in your everyday life in ways that are practical and real. At work, you show up differently. You're still responsible, still committed, still doing what needs to be done, but you're no longer trying to fit into a mold that doesn't align with you. You're more focused, more intentional, less concerned with office dynamics that don't carry real meaning. You engage where it matters, and you step back where it doesn't. You're not trying to impress. You're not trying to blend in. You're simply showing up as yourself, and that changes the way you move through your day. In relationships, you handle things differently as well. You're not holding on to connections out of habit or obligation. You're not forcing conversations or maintaining dynamics that don't feel aligned. You give where it's reciprocated. You stay where there's understanding, and where there isn't, you allow distance without resentment. You're no longer trying to fix everything or make everyone understand you. You're allowing relationships to exist as they are without trying to reshape them into something they're not. And perhaps one of the most freeing changes is this: you stop needing everyone to get you. That need, whether you realized it or not, may have been something that quietly influenced many of your decisions. The desire to be understood, to be seen clearly, to have your perspective recognized. And while that's a natural desire, it's no longer something that controls you. You understand now that not everyone is meant to fully understand your path, your perspective, or your purpose. And that's okay, because once you accept that you're no longer held back by it, you're free to move forward without waiting for approval. Free to make decisions without over-explaining. Free to walk your path without needing it to make sense to everyone else. And that freedom changes everything. It changes how you think, how you respond, how you move through your life. It doesn't remove challenges. It doesn't eliminate uncertainty. But it gives you something far more important. It gives you alignment. And when you are aligned with who you are and where you're going, everything else begins to fall into place in a way that no amount of fitting in ever could. You're still sitting in that car. The same parking lot, the same rows of cars, the same people walking in and out with their bags, the same everyday life unfolding around you. Nothing on the outside has really changed. The world is still moving at the same pace, still following the same patterns it always has. But something inside you is different now. You're not sitting there wondering what's wrong with you anymore. You're not replaying every interaction, questioning why you felt out of place, why conversations didn't fully connect, why you've always carried that quiet sense of being different. That weight, the one you've been carrying for years, begins to lift. Not because your life suddenly became easier, but because you finally understand it. You were never behind. You were never late to something everyone else figured out before you. You were never missing a piece that others had. You were never broken. There was nothing in you that needed to be fixed just so you could fit into spaces that were never designed for you in the first place. And you were never too much or not enough. You were never too aware, too sensitive, too quiet, too different. And you were never lacking, never falling short, never unable to connect. You were simply never meant to fit in. That feeling you've carried, that sense of being slightly out of place no matter where you went, it wasn't a mistake. It wasn't something you needed to correct. It was something that was guiding you, protecting you, keeping you from settling into a life that would have looked right on the outside but felt wrong on the inside. And now, sitting here with that understanding, something settles in you. Not everything is figured out. Not every question is answered, but you're no longer searching for a place to force yourself into. You're no longer trying to belong everywhere, because you understand now that belonging everywhere was never the goal. Alignment was. And the moment you stop trying to fit into every room, every conversation, every expectation, is the moment you start to become who you were always meant to be. That's where your life begins to shift in ways that actually matter. That's where peace replaces pressure. That's where clarity replaces confusion. That's where purpose begins to take shape, not because you chased it, but because you finally stopped resisting what you already knew. So if this message found you at the right moment, if something in you felt recognized, understood, even in a way you can't fully explain, don't ignore that. Take a moment and acknowledge it. And if you've been feeling this way for a long time, I want you to do something simple but powerful. Drop a comment below. I was never meant to fit in. Not for anyone else, but for you. To mark the moment where you stop questioning who you are and start accepting it. And if this message spoke to you, if it put words to something you've been carrying silently, share it with someone who might need to hear this too. Because there are more people out there sitting in their own quiet moments, asking the same questions you once asked. And they don't need more noise. They need clarity, just like you did. And now that you see it, now that you understand it, now that something inside you has shifted, don't go back to shrinking yourself just to feel accepted. Keep moving forward in what you know is true, because you were never lost. You were just called differently.